Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. With this episode, we begin our second season. In this series, we'll take a look at the first 7 ecumenical councils, those meetings of bishops and other leaders that are accepted as authoritative by Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. The first and last of these took place in Nicaea, a suburb of the Eastern Empire's capital. The first was held in the year 325, the last in 787. The ecumenical councils were not the only meetings of bishops in the early centuries of Christianity. There were, in fact, many meetings of bishops, so many that Gregory of Nyssa expressed fatigue from them. St. Augustine referred to meetings as the bishop's burden. And in the 5th century, Pope Leo the Great enacted laws to prevent the opposing evils of too many bishops' meetings and none at all. The history of the Church begins with the meeting of bishops. You can look it up in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1. There we see the apostles gather in a cramped and crowded venue to fill the vacancy left by Judas's treachery and suicide. The men arrive at their decision by following established customs and rules of order. The scene is remarkable for its relatively colorless procedural narrative, especially when you compare it to the pyrotechnics and ecstasies of the chapter that follows. It's a meeting, and Luke's description corresponds to what most of us have experienced in meetings. But the gathering in chapter 1 is not usually called a council. That term is reserved for the gathering described in Acts chapter 15, when the apostles convene in Jerusalem to discuss and decide an important matter, the question of whether Gentiles should be required to observe the entirety of the Jewish ceremonial law. The Church does not number the Council of Jerusalem among the ecumenical councils, but that small assembly became the model and prototype for all subsequent meetings of bishops. And if you ask them, as we've already seen, they'll say they have to attend too many. Not all meetings are councils, however, and not all councils are ecumenical councils. So it will be helpful if we begin by defining terms. But before we proceed to definitions, I must issue a warning. The exercise is more than a bit anachronistic. We who are living in the 21st century of Christianity have easy access to definitions. We need only open an encyclopedia or dictionary or type our terms into an online search engine. The ancients had no such luxury, and they had no such definitions. In fact, it was their conflicts and controversies that produced the definitions we can casually cite in our day. The reality of the council was not brought down from Sinai like the law, or observed in a vision like the temple. It was hard-won in argument and disagreement, and occasionally anathemas. We look back on the ancient councils from the relative comfort and clarity of a developed and intricate theology of church councils. The fathers couldn't consult long centuries of history, as we can, because they were too busy making that history for us. So with all those hedges and caveats in place, let's open the reference books. What is a council? A council is a group of people called together to deliberate. A synonymous term for such meetings is synod. In the ancient documents, the word synod is used interchangeably with council. In the Church, we use those terms to describe a wide variety of gatherings. There are parish councils, provincial councils, and ecumenical councils. The Old Catholic Encyclopedia tightens the focus a bit by making some important distinctions. It defines councils as legally convened assemblies of ecclesiastical dignitaries and theological experts for the purpose of discussing and regulating matters of church doctrine and discipline. So a church council is a meeting summoned by legitimate authority. It's attended by members of the hierarchy who may invite other experts. Its agenda addresses the ordinary work of bishops, which is the doctrine and discipline of the church, and it produces regulations and decrees invested with the authority of the whole assembly. Not all councils are ecumenical councils. There are provincial and regional councils and synods, and those are focused on matters of concern in a limited geographical area. It seems that in the early years of the church there were many councils, and most of them were occupied with local matters, which makes perfect sense given the circumstances. The practice of Christianity was illegal. Indeed, it was a crime that was at least intermittently punishable by death. It would have been difficult in such times and dangerous to convene a group of bishops from many lands. It was hard enough to conduct timely communications between distant churches. The times required a certain subsidiarity in the church. Matters that could be handled locally were handled locally, and sometimes they were handled by a council of bishops. From the 2nd century, we find scattered and passing reports of such meetings. Early councils were convened to resolve differences over the date of the Easter celebration. The church historian Eusebius tells us that there were several synods devoted entirely to this issue. Such synods were held in the east, in Judea, Pontus, Corinth, and Mesopotamia, and in the west, in Gaul, under the leadership of St. Irenaeus of Lyon. We also know of several councils held in Rome during this time. In the 3rd century, the evidence of conciliar activity is more abundant. There was certainly a greater need for such meetings, because the church had grown quite large by then. Christianity was still illegal, and Christians were still persecuted occasionally, but the church was hardly underground. By the middle 200s, its membership was numerous, and its rolls included people of every social class, including the imperial household. As the church grew larger, it was beset by greater problems. There was, for example, the church-wide dispute over the practice of sacramental penance. Should the clergy demand severe public penance before readmitting sinners to communion? The argument went on for decades, and it occupied many councils in places as far-flung as Italy and North Africa. The North African church seems to have been an early adopter of regular councils of bishops. Already in 220, the bishop Agrippinus of Carthage summoned 70 bishops of the region to discuss whether heretical Christians should be rebaptized upon admission to the Catholic Church. By the year 250, the bishops of Africa and Numidia were meeting at least once a year during the springtime, and sometimes more often than that. We know this from the letters of Cyprian of Carthage. By the time Christianity was legalized in 313 AD, councils were a fairly routine part of church life. The Emperor Constantine, who legalized Christianity, valued the work of the church and saw these assemblies as an efficient way to get work done, bring bishops together, and drive them to make decisions which they could then go home and impose on their local congregations. In the year 314, Constantine bestowed an extraordinary privilege on the bishops of the church. In order to encourage their attendance at a council in Gaul that year, he gave them free access to the empire's system of transport. This was usually reserved for diplomats, high-level bureaucrats, and emissaries of the emperor himself. But now, every bishop was invited to reserve carriages big enough to accommodate, and I quote, "2 others of the 2nd rank, whom you yourself shall choose, together with 3 servants who may serve you on the way." End of quote. Constantine was a firm believer in the value of councils, and in 314, quite close to the beginning of his reign, he showed himself willing to put a lot of money where his mouth was. The council, to be held in the city of Arles, was to decide on several matters that had long been dividing the church, including the date of the celebration of Easter. The emperor told the bishops, quote, "Betake yourself to the above-mentioned place before the appointed day, that by your firmness and by the wise unanimity and harmony of the others present, this dispute, which has disgracefully continued until the present time, may be settled in accordance with the proper faith, and that brotherly harmony may be restored, if only gradually." End of quote. Constantine must have been pleased with the outcome because he extended the privilege of free transport to bishops indefinitely. And 50 years later, it was still in place and used quite often. Around the year 380, the pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus complained that the imperial transport in his day was clogged by throngs of bishops who were constantly on their way hither and thither to one synod or another. In giving the bishops such access, Ammianus lamented, Constantine had inadvertently crippled his own courier service. Maybe so, but Constantine may have judged councils to be worth the cost, because 11 years after the council at Arles, the historian Eusebius tells us he convoked a general council and invited the speedy attendance of bishops from all quarters. The Council of Arles had shown Constantine what was possible. Councils could be useful in bringing nagging problems to effective closure. But what if the problems were bigger and involved more churches and covered a much larger geographic spread? Such was the case in the 7 years leading up to 325. In the Egyptian city of Alexandria, a priest named Arius had dared to interrupt his bishop in the middle of a sermon. He challenged the bishop's doctrine and accused him of heresy. Arius asserted that contrary to the bishop's assertions, the Son of God was neither co-eternal nor co-equal with the eternal Father. Arius claimed that the Son was a creature, though the greatest of creatures. Arius claimed that the Son was created at a particular moment in time, so there was a time when the Son did not exist. Arius summed it up in a simple slogan: there was when he was not. Arius had many well-placed connections in the church and the imperial government, and so, even though he was exiled and excommunicated in Alexandria, he was able to make his way across the empire, preaching his peculiar theology as he went. He was phenomenally successful. St. Jerome later said it was as if the world awoke to find itself Arian, so sudden was the conversion of so many. So many indeed, but not all, and those who declared their fidelity to the eternal triune God were dogged in their loyalty. Thus churches were divided in two, and factions warred with factions over who had rights to the parish property. In many places the dispute erupted into violence. Constantine was alarmed. He had labored long years for the unification of the empire and the peace of the church. Now the church seemed to be at war within itself and was dragging his entire empire into the conflagration. No one should be surprised to learn that Constantine called a council to settle the dispute. But it wasn't a local or regional council like all the others that had gone before. It was, in the Greek of Eusebius, synodon oikomenikein. It was an ecumenical or general council. Constantine called for representation from the whole church so that the conclusions of the bishops would be indisputable and universal in their application. Clearly, the emperor had great expectations for the council, and the various bishops had their own agendas, but none of them could have begun to understand what they were really accomplishing. They could not have predicted the authoritative place that general councils would come to occupy in the life of the church. An ecumenical council is always a rather big deal. Only 21 are recognized by the Catholic Church, and only the first 7 by the Orthodox Church. Other Christian bodies accept only the first 1, or 2, or 3, or 4, depending on which council was the first to take aim at one of their own pet doctrines. Not every emperor was as eager to foot the bill for church councils, so they haven't been as frequent. Sometimes entire centuries go by without a council happening. Indeed, 92 years passed between the abrupt ending of Vatican I and the much-hyped opening of Vatican II in 1962, the year before I was born. The logistics were challenging in 325 AD, when 318 bishops showed up in Nicaea. From 1962 to 1965, the parking alone was a nightmare, as 2,881 prelates arrived in Rome to participate in the Second Vatican Council. The church that sits for a council is always, as the historian Philip Hughes put it, a church in crisis. It's a church facing some large and imminent difficulty or danger. The time of a council is a time that demands a decision, and those decisions are consequential. They arrive with the force of law. Catholics believe that a council teaches infallibly when it speaks with authority in matters of faith. Athanasius of Alexandria attended the Council of Nicaea as a theological advisor, and not long afterward he declared, "The word of the Lord put forth by the ecumenical council at Nicaea is an eternal word, enduring forever." Pope Leo the Great said that the decrees of Nicaea were inviolable, and the bishops in attendance operated under divine inspiration. Another historian, John L. Murphy, said of the councils that they were high points of the church's history and true Christian landmarks. But that doesn't mean they were conducted with serene dignity. Sometimes, when deliberations broke down, the council chambers erupted into a brawl. At the Council of Chalcedon, 451, the Patriarch of Constantinople was beaten so badly that he later died from his wounds. The negotiations leading up to a council were often marked by shady maneuvers. At the Council of Ephesus in 431, some bishops tried to delay the sessions long enough for the most elderly bishops to die from the extreme heat. Jesus did not promise his followers a seemly church, but he did promise a church with real power for binding and loosing. In Christianity's first generation, that power was manifest in the Apostolic Council in Jerusalem. It has been invoked for every council since then, even if the Church's understanding of conciliar authority has come but gradually over centuries. In this series of podcasts, we'll examine the stories of the first 7 ecumenical councils. They are in order: the First Council of Nicaea in 325, the First Council of Constantinople in 381, the Council of Ephesus in 431, the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, the Third Council of Constantinople from 680 to 681, and the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. I hope you've enjoyed this first episode of our second season. I hope you'll come along for all the rest. I thank you for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture podcast.